My brother-in-law locked our 12-year-old daughter in a walk-in freezer for exposing what was happening at his wedding. So we fought back until he weaponized CPS and the school system against us. But then we documented everything and turned his greatest strength into the very thing that destroyed him. I never imagined that the weight of one truth, spoken so innocently by a child, could lead to something so cold, so cruel, and so unforgivable. But life has a way of unraveling itself in knots you never saw coming, and mine started to unravel the day my daughter Lila told me what she heard in the basement, her little voice trembling as she tried to piece together the words, her eyes wide and scared like she had stumbled on something meant to stay buried, something whispered in the dark by someone she was told to trust. And in that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine, not because of what she said exactly, but because of how she said it, because children have this raw, unfiltered way of telling the truth that slices cleaner than any blade. And when she said Uncle Mark was talking to someone about the money, about hiding it, about how nobody would ever find out because she doesn't know anything anyway. I didn't know whether to be more afraid for what Lila had overheard, or for what Mark might do if he found out she knew. Because Mark had always been the kind of man who smiled too easily and too widely, whose jokes had that sour edge like spoiled fruit. The kind who touched your shoulder just a beat too long, or looked at you with eyes that never quite blinked at the right times. And even though he was family, my husband's brother, for God's sake, I never felt safe around him. Not really. Not in the way you should with someone who sits across from you at dinner and toasts to your health. And now my daughter, my baby girl, had crossed some invisible line I didn't know existed, and I tried. I swear I tried to be calm, to not let the storm brewing in my chest show on my face. Because kids notice everything, and Lila had already seen too much. So I smiled and nodded and asked her to tell me again, word for word, and she did. This time with her little fingers curled around her stuffed giraffe and her eyes not meeting mine, like she already felt that she'd done something wrong by speaking, and I hugged her so tight I felt her ribs press into my arms, whispering that she did nothing wrong, that she did exactly what she should have. And as I stroked her hair, I stared at the wall behind her, at the framed family picture from 2 Christmases ago, the one where Mark had insisted on standing next to Lila, his hand resting a little too low on her back for my liking. And it hit me like a punch to the gut that I should have listened to my instincts back then. Should have spoken up when things didn't feel right. But back then, everything felt like it could still be explained away with politeness, with excuses, with the kind of blind trust you're taught to extend to people with your last name. And now here I was, my daughter trembling in my arms because she'd told the truth. And that truth had sharp edges, ones that could cut through lies and secrets and years of pretending. And when my husband came home that night, I wanted to tell him everything. But the words dried up in my throat the moment I saw his face, tired and closed off. Like he'd already decided what was worth hearing and what wasn't. So instead, I said nothing, just watched as he kissed Leela on the forehead and asked her how her day was. And she didn't say a word, just clung to me like a lifeline. And that silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It screamed that something was broken, and I didn't know how to fix it. So I waited until the house was quiet, until the sound of the television downstairs and the dull hum of the fridge were the only things keeping me grounded. And I called my sister, the only person I thought might believe me without asking why I didn't come forward sooner. And she listened, bless her. She listened through my shaking voice and the pauses where I tried not to cry. And she said, you need to keep Lila close. Don't let her out of your sight. If he knows she knows something, he might do something you can't take back. And those words hit me like a freight train, because I realized then that I didn't know what Mark was capable of. Not really. And when you realize that someone close to you might be dangerous, the whole world tilts. Like your memories start rearranging themselves to reveal the parts you didn't want to see. Like how Mark used to joke about how kids are so gullible. How easy it is to make them forget things. Or how he once got Lila ice cream even when I said no, just to watch me squirm when she smiled up at me with sticky lips and joy in her eyes. And it wasn't the action, it was the smirk behind it. Like he wanted to remind me who had the power. And now I was seeing everything in a new, sickening light. Like I had been asleep and was finally waking up. And that night I didn't sleep. I just sat by Lila's bed, watching her chest rise and fall, wondering how much time I had before everything exploded, because I knew Mark would find out eventually. Knew he'd catch wind that something was off, and I was right. Because 3 days later, he showed up unannounced, smiling that same too-wide smile, holding a plastic bag with cookies. He claimed he'd baked, and I felt every muscle in my body tighten when I opened the door and saw him there, his eyes flicking past me like he was looking for someone. And when he asked if Lila was home, I told him she wasn't feeling well, that she was resting, and he nodded too slowly, said something about coming back later with soup. And as he turned to leave, he said, you know, kids say the funniest things sometimes. And it wasn't the words themselves, it was the way he said them, like a warning wrapped in syrup. And I slammed the door the moment he stepped off the porch, locked it, bolted it, and then ran upstairs to check on Leela, and she was there, sitting up in bed, hugging that damn giraffe like her life depended on it. And when she looked at me, her lip quivered, and she whispered, I'm scared, Mommy. And I sat beside her, brushing her hair back, telling her she didn't have to be. that I would protect her no matter what. But the truth was, I was scared, too. Scared in a way I hadn't felt since I was a child myself. Scared that something had already started and I was too late to stop it. And that night, I told my husband. I told him everything, every word Leela had said, every look Mark had given me, every doubt I'd buried over the years, and he stared at me like I'd grown a second head, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. And then he got angry not at Mark, but at me, accusing me of poisoning our daughter's mind, of letting paranoia fester into delusion. And I couldn't believe it, couldn't believe he would choose denial over his own child's safety. And we fought. God, we fought. And Lila must have heard because she started crying, sobbing from her room, and I rushed to her, held her again, and told her it was going to be okay, that I wouldn't let anyone hurt her, and I meant it. Even if I didn't know how, even if the walls of our house no longer felt like they could keep the monsters out, because one of them already had a key. The days after that were quieter. Not peaceful, never that, but quieter in a way that felt sacred. Like the world was finally giving us a moment to breathe after everything it had taken. And I found myself watching Leela constantly, not out of fear like before, but awe. This kind of bone-deep reverence for how someone so small could carry so much pain and still offer me a smile that lit up everything inside me. And I think that's what kept me going in the end. Not justice, not revenge, but Hertha sound. Of her laughter coming back in bits and pieces, like a song I thought I'd lost. The way her drawings started to include sunshine again. Yellow crayons smeared across paper instead of the jagged gray lines she used to draw when we first got to my sister's place. And the more I saw her come back to herself, the more I started finding pieces of me too. Pieces I didn't know I'd lost in the years of being silent, of swallowing my instincts, of pretending that certain smiles weren't dangerous and certain silences didn't mean fear. And it's strange how clearly you can see the past once you've been forced to look at the truth with your eyes open. Like how I now remember the first time Mark made me uncomfortable not with what he did, but what he didn't do. The way he looked at Lila the day she was born, not like an uncle, not like a man moved by the miracle of a new life, but like someone assessing something fragile, something he could mold or break, and I ignored it. I told myself I was tired, hormonal, seeing things that weren't there, and now I hate that part of me. The one that kept quiet because I didn't want to disrupt. The family, didn't want to cause waves. And I hate how long it took for me to stop protecting people who never protected me, who never protected her. And I don't say that out loud. Not to anyone but myself. Late at night, when Leela's finally asleep and I'm sitting in the kitchen with a mug of cold tea and a heart still too heavy to rest, and I wonder if I'll ever stop living in the aftermath. If there will ever be a day when I don't think about that freezer, that basement, the seconds I lost running through the house and screaming her name, the seconds that almost changed everything, and then I look at her, sleeping with her arm flung across her pillow, and her mouth open just a little. And I know that day isn't today, but maybe it's coming. Maybe we're building something stronger now. Brick by trembling brick, and we moved again, to a place where no one knows our story. And I enrolled her in a new school where the teachers smile without pity and the kids don't look at her like she's different. And she came home last week with paint on her jeans and a story about how she and another girl named Maya built a castle out of Legos at recess. And she said, "We made a freezer too, but it was just pretend," and I froze. Every muscle in my body going rigid, and she looked at me, her face serious, and added, "I told her that some freezers are bad but most of them are just cold." And I didn't know what to say, didn't know whether to cry, or hold her, or both. Because how does a 6-year-old carry wisdom like that? How does she speak of danger with such calm? And I realized then that she wasn't just surviving, she was learning how to make sense of her own story, how to write the rest of it in her own words. And I needed to let her. I needed to stop hovering so close she couldn't breathe. Because the only thing worse than being hurt is never being allowed to move beyond the pain. So I hugged her and told her I was proud of her. That castles and freezers and all, she was the bravest person I knew, and she beamed at me in that way. Only children can, with her whole body, and asked if she could have ice cream. And I laughed, actually laughed, because I didn't remember the last time I did. And we ate it on the floor of our new apartment with the windows open and music playing. And for those 10 minutes, nothing else existed. Not court dates, not nightmares. Not the ghosts of men who tried to silence us, and when I tucked her in later, she whispered, "You saved me, didn't you?" And I wanted to say yes. I wanted to say I'd pulled her out of the dark and into the light all by myself. But the truth is, she saved me too. In ways she never understand. By surviving, by speaking, by reminding me what love looks like, when it's fierce and terrified and unstoppable. And I kissed her forehead and said, "We saved each other, because we did, because every step forward we took together, every truth we refused to bury, every wound we named out loud, was a kind of salvation. And I don't know what comes next. I don't know if the world will ever truly feel safe again, if I'll ever stop watching strangers too closely or locking the windows twice before bed, but I do know that we are not victims anymore. And I refuse to live as one, not for me, not for her." And when the reporter called last week asking if I wanted to share our story publicly, I said no, not yet. Because this story doesn't belong to the world, it belongs to my daughter. 2. The voice she found when the cold tried to steal it from her, to the truth she told that nearly cost her everything. And maybe someday, when she's ready, she'll tell it in her own words. And I'll sit beside her, not to speak for her, but to remind her she never has to face the dark alone again. And if nothing else, that's the legacy I'll leave her. Not the fear, not the silence, but the power that comes from speaking, from surviving, from choosing, even when it would be easier to stay quiet. And the next morning, when we woke up, to sunlight and birdsong and the smell of waffles, I looked at her, dancing barefoot in the kitchen. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I believed in joy again, not because we were healed, but because we were healing, and that was enough. There's a strange numbness that takes over when you've been through something like this. Like your brain decides you've hit your emotional capacity and starts shutting things off one by one. And I felt it in the weeks that followed. A kind of hollow quiet where grief should have been, where rage used to boil. And even though I was still functioning, feeding Leela, brushing her hair, answering the phone when the lawyers called, it was like I was watching myself do it all from a distance, like my soul had taken a few steps back and was just waiting to see if I'd collapse or survive. And maybe that's what survival really looks like. Not strength, not clarity, just inertia. The refusal to stop moving. And I moved. God, I moved. Through custody hearings where my husband sat across from me without a trace of shame in his face. Through police interviews where I had to describe in painful, excruciating detail what I found in that basement, what I pulled my daughter out of. Through news reporters who caught wind of the case and circled like vultures, trying to turn my baby's trauma into headlines. And through it all, Leela stayed close, never more than a few feet away from me, her tiny hand always reaching for mine, her voice soft and hesitant, like she was afraid that speaking too loud might bring it all back. And I tried to smile for her, to pretend we were okay now, safe now. But safety isn't a place you arrive at, it's something you constantly rebuild, brick by brick, breath by breath. And some nights, when she was asleep, I would sit in the bathroom with the shower running so she wouldn't hear me cry, knees to my chest, rocking like I used to when I was a child. Because how do you explain to a 6-year-old that the people who hurt her might not ever fully go away, that they live in courtrooms and memories and dreams and sometimes in the eyes of the people you used to love? And I couldn't tell her that, not yet, maybe not ever. So instead I made her pancakes in the shape of animals, and let her watch cartoons longer than I normally would, and took her to parks and neighborhoods where no one knew us. And we pretended, both of us, that we were just a regular mom and daughter, out for some sun. And then came the trial, the slow grinding machine of justice that never quite fits the damage it's supposed to repair. And I had to stand up in front of strangers and say words that burned my throat. He locked her in a freezer, and then I had to hear the defense twist it, try to make it sound like maybe it wasn't intentional, maybe he was just unstable, confused, maybe she wandered in there on her own and he panicked. And I wanted to scream. Wanted to drag every person in that courtroom down to that freezing basement and show them what it felt like. The cold, the fear, the desperation, but I didn't. I sat there and held Leela's hand when she testified, watched her fidget with the edge of her dress and look at the floor when they asked her if she remembered how cold it was, and she said yes. She remembered, and I think in that moment everyone in that courtroom felt the temperature drop, because there's something about a child's truth that you can't twist into something else, no matter how hard you try. And when the verdict finally came guilty on multiple counts, attempted murder, endangerment, conspiracy, I felt nothing. Not relief, not joy, just emptiness. Like the part of me that was waiting for closure realized it was never coming. And when they led Mark out in cuffs, he turned and looked at me, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not mine, not Leela Sissand. That should have satisfied me, but it didn't. Because the damage was already done. And even though he was going to prison, even though he'd rot in a cell for what he did, I knew I'd still check every basement we entered for the rest of my life. Still flinch when the freezer motor hummed too loudly. Still wake up sweating from dreams where I couldn't get the lid open in time. And it didn't stop there, because after Mark's sentencing came the slow unraveling of everything else: my marriage, my finances, the home we used to share that now sat vacant and full of ghosts, and my husband, now ex-husband, fled to God knows where, the moment the trial was over, claiming he had nothing left, that I'd ruined him, and maybe I had. Maybe I shattered the version of his life he wanted to believe in, but I didn't care, because all I ever wanted was to keep Leela safe. And he failed her. He failed us both, and I would never forgive that, never. And the therapist we started seeing said that healing would take time, that children are resilient if given the right support. And I wanted to believe that. I needed to. So I kept showing up, kept bringing Leela to those sessions, even when she didn't want to talk. Even when she clung to me in the waiting room with tears in her eyes. And I told her we were planting seeds, little ones, that one day would bloom into something strong enough to carry her pain. And some days she'd nod, and some days she'd just cry. And both were okay, because she was trying. And so was I. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, we started to come back to life. Not in big, Sweeping moments, but in the quiet ones, when she laughed at a silly dog on TV, when she fell asleep on the couch with her mouth open and her giraffe tucked under her arm, when she asked me if we could paint her room in our new apartment sky blue, because blue means happy now, not cold. And I said yes, of course, anything you want. And when I watched her press those paint rollers against the wall with her little hands, giggling as flecks of blue landed in her hair, I felt something shifted me, like maybe this wasn't the end of our story, but the beginning of a different one. One that was quieter, safer, truer, and I knew we still had a long way to go, that the scars wouldn't vanish, that the nightmares might come and go for years, but I also knew she was still here, still fighting, still full of a light that Mark couldn't kill no matter how hard he tried, and I realized then that this was what surviving looked like, not perfection, not peace, but persistence. The refusal to give up even when the cold tries to take everything from you. And maybe one day I'll tell her the whole story. Not just the parts she lived through, but the ones I shielded her from, the ones I screamed through alone in the dark, and maybe she'll understand what it costs to keep her safe. Or maybe she won't, and that's okay too, because my love for her isn't about being understood. It's about never letting go, no matter how cold the world gets. And as I tucked her into bed that night and kissed her on the forehead, she looked up at me and said, "You didn't let him win, did you?" And I smiled, tears burning behind my eyes, and said, "No, baby, he lost the second you started telling the truth." The hours after the hospital were a blur, not the soft kind that fades with time, but the kind that burns into your memory, where every second is soaked in panic, and the air smells like antiseptic and fear. And I sat there, staring at Lee's tiny hand wrapped in mine, the IV taped to her skin like a fragile tether holding her to this world, and I couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop running through the timeline in my head over and over, trying to understand how I missed it, how I ever thought Mark was just weird and not dangerous, how many times I let him near her, let him hold her, how many moments I ignored the unease that scratched at my insides, and now I could feel that guilt crawling up my throat like bile, and it wouldn't go down, it just sat there, thick and poisonous. And I didn't even know what to say to the officers when they came in to talk to me, because how do you explain that someone in your family tried to freeze your child to death? How do you find the words to describe that kind of evil without sounding insane? And the younger officer, a woman with kind eyes and a notebook she didn't really look at, sat next to me and asked gentle questions, her voice the only soft thing in that sterile room, and I tried to answer. I did, but I kept looking at Lila, and breaking apart, and the officer said they had taken Mark and said he hadn't resisted, hadn't said much of anything, just sat there with that same eerie calm, and all I could think was how close I came to losing her, how if I had stopped at one more red light, or taken one more call, she might have died, in that basement, frozen and alone, and I couldn't stop the tears then. They just kept falling until I was gasping, and the nurse had to come in and rub my back, telling me to breathe, just breathe. And I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because when I woke up it was dark outside and Lila was awake, her eyes half-lidded but aware, and she whispered, "Mommy," and I leaned in so fast I nearly knocked over her water cup, and she looked at me and said, I was so cold, and I felt my soul crack straight down the middle, because it was the thing I'd been dreading, the memory she would carry, and I stroked her hair and said, "I know, baby, I know." And she asked, "Why did Uncle Mark put me in there?" And I didn't know how to answer. Didn't know how to make sense of cruelty for a 6-year-old who still believed in magic and bedtime songs. So I just held her hand and said, "Because sometimes people are very, very sick inside, and it's not your fault." And I think part of her understood. Or maybe she just wanted to believe me because I was her mother. And children are so tragically trusting, even when they've been hurt. And the next morning the doctors said she was strong, that she was lucky, that if I had come even 10 minutes later, things might have turned out differently. And that word lucky hit me like a slap, because lucky shouldn't be what we call a child who survives attempted murder. Lucky shouldn't be the word used when you dodge a bullet by inches. And I wanted to scream at them, scream at the world, but I just nodded and signed whatever papers they put in front of me because I had no energy left to argue. And when we finally got home, I didn't let her out of my sight. Not for a second, not even to go to the bathroom. And I could tell she was different now, quieter, more careful. Like she was testing every shadow before stepping into it, and that terrified me more than anything else. Because I knew then that Mark hadn't just tried to hurt her body, he had tried to break something in her, something innocent and vital. And I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't. So I started digging, going through old files, emails, texts, anything I could find that connected Mark to whatever Leela had overheard in the basement. The money, the deal, the secret hand. The more I looked, the more I realized this wasn't just about a grudge or a mental break. It was about something much darker, something calculated. And I found a folder on my husband's computer, buried under fake names and empty files. And inside it were spreadsheets, scanned documents, wire transfers in strange amounts, sent to strange accounts. And Mark's name was all over it. But so was my husband's. And when I confronted him, when I showed him the folder and demanded to know what the hell was going on, he didn't even look surprised. Just tired. Like he'd been waiting for the moment I'd figure it out. And he said, You don't understand what's at stake. And I screamed back. Leela's life was at stake. And he flinched, but he didn't deny it, not once. And I realized then that he had known. Maybe not about the freezer, maybe not the plan, but he had known something bad, and he had looked away, and that made him just as guilty. And I told him I wanted a divorce, that I wanted full custody, that I never wanted him near our daughter again, and he said, "You'll regret this." And I said, "Not as much as I'd regret keeping her near any of you." And I left. I packed Leela's things, shoved essentials into bags with shaking hands. And we stayed with my sister while I called a lawyer and gave the police everything I found. And it turns out Mark had been laundering money through a business he and my husband ran on the side. Money connected to people I didn't even want to think about. And innocent Leela had overheard something she shouldn't have. Something that could have unraveled the whole operation. And instead of protecting her, they saw her as a threat, a 6-year-old threat. And that was all it took for Mark to decide. She needed to be silenced. And the rage I felt then, the fury, it was like a living thing, breathing fire in my veins. And I swore I would make sure they paid, all of them, because this wasn't just betrayal, it was treason against the very idea of family, of trust, of safety, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not while I had breath left in my body. And I knew the road ahead would be long and ugly, that court dates and custody battles and testimony would take their toll. But I didn't care, because Lila was alive, and as long as she was breathing, I would fight like hell to give her a life where she never had to be afraid again. And as I watched her sleep that night in the guest room at my sister's, curled up with her giraffe under a blanket she now never let go of, I whispered into the dark, "I will never let anyone hurt you again." And I meant it, with every fiber of my being, even if it meant becoming someone I didn't recognize, because I had already lost too much, and I wouldn't lose her too. The thing about fear is that it settles in quietly at first, like a shadow creeping across the room, unnoticed until it's too dark to see anything else. And after that night after the fight, after Leela's sobs faded into hiccuping sleep against my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not by the world, but by something closer. Like the walls of our home had ears, and the floors whispered our secrets to someone waiting just outside. And for the next few days, I kept Lila home from school, pretending she had a fever, brushing her curls behind her ears and telling her everything would be fine, even as I counted how many times the phone rang without anyone answering on the other end. Even as I noticed my husband withdrawing, growing colder, spending more hours at work or at Mark's place helping with the business stuff he never told me about, and I began to wonder if he really believed me or if he just didn't care. If he had known something all along and chose to ignore it because family loyalty was stronger than truth in his eyes. And that's when I started documenting things. Writing everything down in a notebook I kept hidden in the laundry room behind the shelf with the fabric softeners no one ever touched. A list of everything Leela said, every strange call, every moment Mark showed up uninvited, and I thought, maybe if something happens, if he does something, I'll have a trail, I'll have proof. Because women like me are taught early that no one believes you unless you come with receipts, and even then they still might say you're overreacting. Emotionally unstable. So I wrote it all down, every creeping suspicion, every ache in my gut that told me danger was circling, and I started carrying pepper spray in my purse, checked the locks 3 times before bed. And when I told Leela never to open the door unless I was right there, she nodded like she already understood what the world was capable of. And it broke my heart to see my baby learn fear before she learned fractions. To see her jump at shadows and sleep with her giraffe pressed so hard against her chest I worried she might stop breathing. And I knew we couldn't live like this forever, couldn't stay frozen in this holding pattern of dread and silence. And part of me thought maybe we should leave, just pack up and go somewhere he couldn't find us. But it wasn't that easy. Nothing ever is, when the threat is your own family, and every time I looked into my husband's eyes, searching for the man I married, all I saw was a wall, like he had already picked a side and it wasn't mine. And that morning, the morning it all came to a head, started like any other, with cereal and cartoons and the illusion of normalcy, and I stepped out just for a minute, just to grab Leela's prescription from the pharmacy because she had caught a cold. A real one this time, and I told her to stay inside, to keep the door locked and not answer for anyone, and she nodded, clutching her tissue box and giraffe. Brave as ever, and I kissed her forehead and promised I'd be right back, and God, I was only gone 15 minutes, just 15 minutes, but that's all it took, because when I pulled back into the driveway, something felt wrong. The door was ajar just enough to show a sliver of darkness inside, and I dropped the paper bag of medicine and ran, heart hammering so hard I could barely breathe. And I burst into the house calling her name, screaming for her, but the living room was empty, the kitchen silent, and that's when I saw it, the back door, wide open, swinging in the wind, and the fear that had been simmering under my skin all week exploded into full-blown panic. And I tore through the house, screaming her name, Lila, Lila, where are you, baby? And it was only when I reached the basement door and saw the faint light creeping up from underneath that I knew. Somehow I just knew, and I threw the door open and ran down the stairs 2 at a time, the air growing colder with every step until it hit me like a wall. The unmistakable metallic sting of freezing air and something else, fear. Maybe, or guilt. I can't tell them apart anymore. At the far end of the basement, the old chest freezer sat with its lid wide open, and Mark standing beside it, staring down inside with that same smile. The one that made my skin crawl. And for a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, and then he looked up, like he hadn't expected me. Like I was the interruption in whatever sick fantasy he was acting out, and I screamed so loud it tore my throat open. And I ran at him, fists flying, not even thinking, just pure animal instinct, because my baby was in that box. My little girl was in that fucking freezer, and I needed to get her out. And we struggled, Mark and I. He tried to hold me back, muttering something about how it wasn't what it looked like, that she was just hiding, just playing. But I saw the way his hands gripped my wrists, the force behind them, and I kicked him with everything I had. Scratched and clawed until he let go, and I threw myself at the freezer, pulled open the lid fully, and there she was curled up like a baby bird, eyes closed, lips blue, and I thought she was dead. I thought she was gone, and something inside me shattered, something I don't think will ever heal. But then she gasped, a tiny choke breath that cracked the silence like lightning, and I hauled her out of there, sobbing, wrapping her in my arms and screaming at Mark to get the hell away from us. And he just stood there, watching, his face empty, like he didn't understand what he'd done, or maybe he did and just didn't care. And I ran, carrying her up the stairs, screaming for help, for someone, anyone, and it all blurred after that. Runs, paramedics, a police officer asking me questions I could barely answer through my tears. And Leela was taken to the hospital wrapped in warm blankets, her little body shaking, but alive. And I don't know how I'm supposed to process what happened. How I'm supposed to live with the knowledge that I left her alone for just a few minutes, and that was all it took for a monster to strike. A monster who shared our blood, who had been in our home, at our table, laughing and eating and pretending to be someone he wasn't, and I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself, because I should have done more, should have seen it coming, should have protected her better. And when I sat beside her hospital bed that night, watching her sleep, her cheeks pink again, her lips no longer blue, I made a promise, not just to her but to myself, that I would never let anyone hurt her again, not while I was breathing. And if that meant burning every bridge and dragging every secret into the light, then so be it. Because no truth, no matter how ugly, is worse than what almost happened. And the scariest part is that I still don't know how deep it goes. How many lies were layered over the truth. How much my husband knew or ignored or helped cover up. But I will find out, I swear it. Because the truth almost got my daughter killed. And I won't stop until every last piece of it is exposed. No matter who I have to confront. No matter how much it hurts. Because my little girl deserves a world where telling the truth doesn't end in a freezer,